It's been a real pleasure to work with Cecily on this really monumental exhibition that covers over 20 years of photography in my practice and working really closely in selecting the works and looking for through lines.
One thing that I've always been struck by with your work is your really unique approach to art making. And I think that probably comes from your undergraduate degree in anthropology, but I definitely see an anthropologic approach to the way you're researching your subject, whether that be family or public lands, really investigating with critical but neutral, would you say, maybe eye?
It's interesting when you mentioned that neutral part, because I feel like in my earlier work, it was very personal. So we have that first image of my grandmother that I took when I was in college, like my second year of college, and I was studying anthropology and I was studying Japanese language and really thinking about my own family history and looking at that from an anthropological view, thinking about these migrational patterns, these things that we connect to, the things that remain important symbolically and also culturally over migration over time. So I think that really started from kind of a personal perspective, but then really looking at the larger landscape and how we feel like we might kind of belong in these new lands, these new places that we've migrated to. And those times I think they become neutral when I'm really striving to be a good listener. And then other times I feel critical about how we are acting upon the land. So we get kind of a mix of both. And certainly in the work landscapes, which is here, I'm being very kind of critical about how the camera is acting upon the land. All the work we see here are selections from bodies of work, and I think that that was like really key in how we put the exhibition together. So that first picture of my grandmother, the last time that I saw her, that body of work grew over time. Like I didn't know I was making a body of work. I just knew it was important to continue to photograph there. And that was also 20 years. Ultimately, I made 87 images in the exhibition to represent every year of her life. And here we've edited down to maybe 10, which I think are 10 really important images that tell that story. So I think that the way that the work is selected also has kind of helped us see the connections between the bodies of work.
Well, I love that your earliest body of work is based around your grandmother and your relationship to your grandmother and also that family ancestry. And your newest body of work is also really looking into your family history and the impact of society and how your family as Japanese Americans were treated and also found their own survival. And that is also a way of kind of approaching that with an anthropological view.
The work Excavate Artifacts of Being is this kind of working title, this really brand new work. It's all really recalling a family story. It's really recalling the specific family story about hearing my aunt talk about burying all these things that were written in Japanese, culturally significant objects, things that you didn't want to identify with that might make you look like you were patriotic. So anything in Japanese being hidden and destroyed.
Well, and what you just said made me think of another kind of through line in many of the bodies of your work is the notion of loss. And then of course with Excavate, as you were just speaking, but looking at even these grand places and imprints. Would you talk a little bit about that?
So in Rattlesnake Lake, we're talking about loss of a place. It starts at a very personal moment where I go to the lake with a new romance, right? So I'm like thinking of this like beautiful, like, you know, who doesn't love to be in this like beautiful location and go swimming in summertime? And as I'm swimming, I can see all these stumps and they're like kind of almost like beheaded creatures. And I had been really pretty active in the environmental movement. So I was living in Washington State and a lot of old growth forests were being cut. You could enjoy it one day and then see it being destroyed the next. It's a really intense time to think about how we were being humans on the planet and the kind of extractions that we were doing without really caring. It's like thinking about personal loss, thinking about loss of also habitat or maybe loss of place, loss of culture, loss of language. And then really looking at longer, deeper time, right? We're like almost looking at it from if we can look at it from a non-human perspective, right? Looking at deep time or geological time, celestial time.
I feel looking at your work that there is such a timeless quality to the images, even when there are elements that are identifiable It really doesn't place the work in a specific time. I think this specifically about Rattlesnake Lake and some of the other works as well, but there's really this enchanting quality to it where you can imagine yourself in the space, but also in a different time. And is that something you're doing intentionally, looking at the landscape, or is that just a quality of how you're working?
It's intentional in terms of the way that I'm making is happening across a great amount of time. Also, a lot of times my images are actually photographed, like the actual exposure of the image, especially working with the 4x5 camera, the large format field camera. It's one image at a time. Pull the slide, you make the exposure, and sometimes exposure is 8 minutes long, 10 minutes long, 30 minutes long, maybe 5 seconds, but maybe even half a second if it's bright enough. But I love to photograph at this time of day that is a little ambiguous. So often at dusk or at dawn, and we see that in Hatsubon, we see that in Rattlesnake Lake, in Near and Far.
In your work, there is such a strong intentionality. You think about the materials you're using, you think about the process you're using. Of course, when you're using a large format camera, the timing is really important and the lighting, and you can only take that shot once because then the light has changed. I think the way you are approaching art making as a photographer is very different from the way a lot of people may think about photography. You're not taking hundreds of images and selecting the best one, but you really have to set it up intentionally and know exactly what you're going for and get that one shot.
Yeah, sometimes there's only one. And then the moment passes or it's too dark. And I think that was really important with Hatsubon. Yes, so this is the moment before dawn and then when the sun, and we're actually releasing the boat as the moment that the sun first hits the water.
Such a moving moment.
I remember at that moment too thinking, this is the moment, this is the ceremony. This isn't a
Performance.
I knew it was really important that we did this. I wasn't intentionally thinking, oh, I'm gonna make a body of work around it until the body of work wanted to be made, right? It was like being guided, oh, now I have these images, they need to be shared.
And your family, your sister and your mother were supportive of you documenting the ceremony and the process and creating this body of work?
Yeah, they were. Even actually right after my father passed away, my mother asked me to take a photograph.
It's a really moving image, and there's a way that everyone can connect with this work. Each have our own experience with loss and death, and it's expressed in such a beautiful way that the viewer can connect with.
That particular ceremony is photographed in Hawaii, where my mother was born and where my father's buried.
Well, and that's a great example of just thinking about the way you approach the project. I mean, I know you weren't thinking of it as a project at the time. It was more of a ceremony for your family and yourself, and you're celebrating your father's life. In setting that up, you were thinking a lot about the light and also the materials. It's the only case in this exhibition where you've printed on silk. It has that ethereal, really beautiful feel that shows the influence of the viewer as well.
A lot of the materials that I work with do reference Japanese traditions of material usage, and then I'm bringing in also contemporary method. The cherry wood is the ore. Cherry is also a very important tree. And then the boat is made from ash, which is considered the tree of life in the Gaelic tradition and really honoring the Jones side of my father.
We talked a lot about materials and timing and the notion of time. We didn't talk about the imprints work, the cyanotypes we see over here. Would you like to speak about those a little bit?
That is definitely an act of love. And the imprints, they are animals that I've encountered primarily that have been killed by humans, whether on this wall, they're all animals that I encountered while on the road, sometimes on the trail. So they're almost all of them are printed on site. So I'll bring cyanotype. If I see an animal and I have paper with me, like the rabbit or the hawk, sometimes I've coated paper and brought it back to the site. And of course, as you know, sometimes I brought the animal back and then printed it and then buried it, or now in these days I leave it out. But really honoring their life in this way that humans have really come to dominate the landscape, that they're really unnecessary deaths. My impulse is to go and remove it from the road so it doesn't get further desecrated on the road. And that's where the first one, the fox, happens, is that I go to pick her up and just to pull her off the road, and she's still warm, and she's a mother because it was in the spring, and you can tell because she's full of milk, and I couldn't just throw her in a ditch. I just had this feeling like this life should be dignified. I want to dignify this life by, and also almost as a gesture of apology. So I went home and coated the paper, and then, carefully handled her body and placed her in the sun, and allowed that kind of like the spirit of the fox to form on the paper.
It's such a beautiful tribute in the way you can see the detail of even just the tiniest hair. We may have a chance when we're walking around to talk about the beds.
Okay. With the beds that we have in here, there are over 200 probably in this room. There are a few more than that.
Of course.
But when I first started this work, it also came from a place of it was actually thinking about loss of home, because we were working with the NGO Direct Aid Iraq and working with Iraqi refugees in Jordan. I was thinking a lot about the sense of home, working with refugees, and we were actually delivering beds. And so the kind of privilege that we have to have a home, and also maybe something that we don't really think about, like we've maybe taken it for granted, that we have a safe place to sleep. And so that was my initial impulse to photograph the bed, was in this way to say, look what I have. And also, after having just talked about Hatsubon and talking about my father, there are so many stories embedded, even though there's no human. There's not, for the most part, there's a few figures in the work, but there's so many memories. This is actually the bed the couch that I was sleeping in my parents' bedroom the night that my father called out in the middle of the night, "Bring me the oar." And then I went on to carve this oar for him and then make him this boat. So the way that I think also that the work overlaps in time. So maybe I'm sleeping on the bed and I photograph this bed, but I'm also photographing my father, and then a year later I'm making Hatsubon. So I think that it becomes where it feels like there's not a whole lot of separation between what we think about the idea of a project. This is my grandmother's bed, which you also see in Passage. It's one of those tiny little prints. In the room, you can see the shoji screen in the background. It's just photographed differently.
As you mentioned, there aren't many people present, but their imprint is present. And so it's very clear that someone was laying in this bed, and the absence of the body in this work is really striking. It's such a beautiful photographic diary of your nomadic lifestyle that you had for that 10-year period where you were traveling and doing residencies and all the things you spoke of. But I also like to think of this work as an interior landscape, both literally and then also thinking about your own thoughts and what you're discovering and what you're going through during all these different times of documenting your grandmother's home and spending your father's last days with him. And so we have your interior landscape of literally where you were staying, but also these memories and these thoughts that you're having during this time. Well, I'm excited to move into this space and talk about these grand places. This was the work that we first started talking about when developing this exhibition, and I really wanted it to be in the largest space in the gallery so we could have a grand view and have the experience of viewing landscape from kind of a distance.
The title of our show is really pulled from a lot of things that are happening in this work. Right, so we have both the intimate, which we just talked about with the beds, and then we have the infinite. So I feel like this image here that we have printed, this mural of infinite sky and the sense of boundlessness, the rainbow being this really ephemeral moment. In this image, we are at the boundary of human-created boundaries of the Tohono O'odham Nation, the Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument, which borders Mexico and is a place that a lot of these photographs are made at. It's a protected public land. We're also at the border, the international border between nations of the United States and Mexico. All these borders and boundaries that are restricting people and animals and have to do with climate are all within this photograph, but we're all under the same skies. I think also the way that this space has been laid out, there's sort of conversation between this really expansive infinite and then we have the intimate. The story wall was a way to really like ground the work in the intimacy of being on these sites. So I'm traveling often, sometimes backpacking, sometimes hiking, but definitely traveling in the MRS, the Mobile Research Studio, kind of living in this trailer, which is also a workspace, creating these vignette stories. So talking about the experience of being there, the real guiding questions in these grand places has been really about like, what does public mean? Or how do we identify what the public is and what is belonging, national belonging look like in these, quote, American landscapes. And so asking that question to myself, who is welcome, right? Who is welcome? How do we, care for these places? And also, what do we return? We've taken so much, including wanting some, spiritual wellness. We look for respite in the land. And what is the exchange that we have with this place? And here the vignettes then are telling stories that are, to me, really illustrating that relationship of sometimes the discomfort of not feeling welcome or not necessarily belonging to these places. So now we're back at Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument, which we were just standing in, looking at the rainbow. And now I'm looking at the very simple but heartbreaking story of a coyote that I see at sunset in 2019, running along the wall. And the wall's not yet finished. So I'm thinking, the coyote will still be able to cross over, and how eerie it is to see this beautiful ridgeline of the sunset through this incarcerated view. And then 2 years later, returning, and now the wall is finished. There no longer is a gap in the wall, and it's rained, like we saw in the earlier photograph, and the erosion of this road that's been built, and there's this mud, and I see these coyote tracks in the mud, and I'm wondering about their story. I'll never know, right? But just like how that is such a metaphor for it's looking at a landscape that's been divided by humans. But what does that mean to everything else? To the rivers, to the water, to the creatures. So kind of looking at that as a vignette, as an intimate vignette within larger questions.
And here you're sharing some of your journal entries as well. That gives us a different view into your research into this project and the impact it's having on you and your emotional responses to both the way the humans and animals are reacting to these divisions, and also the way the land has changed.
Right. This was an aspect of these grand places, trying to make it feel maybe a little bit more tangible, is the field notes table. Included in here are field notes, messages, some notes I've written myself, some photographs, 4x5 contact prints made in the landscape. And I even included I was trying to catalog all the little tiny cyanotypes that I'm making of the cholla, of sabaros, of the different plants. Some of them are endemic, some of them are not. Yeah, a few pieces of, in anthropology you'd call midden, which is a sociological word for other people's garbage that you can study and you can learn about them. And so in my way, and in this particular work also, it's an accordion book along the shoreline of Powell Reservoir when it's at its lowest point. So I'm also thinking about drought, human impact, water use. In some ways, I'm looking at also the kinds of things that one might encounter in the landscape, which are a lot of signs of human impact. And the one bone that I decided to include here is a cow vertebra, and that's really referencing the overgrazing of public lands and what that has done to the landscape in less positive ways, with erosion. And
I love this inclusion of the photographs that weren't included necessarily in large format in the exhibition, but you've included them in a postcard format. And that really speaks to your family history of experiencing the land as you were growing up and connecting back to your grandmother as well.
Yeah, it does. Thank you for bringing that up. So we spent every summer with my grandmother growing up, and so we would go to Hawaii, but she always wanted to come with us. She was always game for a road trip. And so looking back on some of her own postcards or the times that we would beg, can we go to the gift shop and collect things? And so I'm also referencing a bit of the gift shops that we see. And then the other thing I just really want to point out is, I'm going to pick one of these up. I have spent a lot of time in the last couple of years really looking at ukiyo-e prints. So in the Japanese tradition, that print was mass produced as a way to show the landscape, and people would bring home a stack of prints as a souvenir. Studying these prints so intently, I was really kind of thinking about the composition of ukiyo-e, the way that a human will look really small within the landscapes. You'll see like people in a boat, but they're like this big, they're a gesture of a human. And then you'll see maybe a larger landscape, and maybe Mount Fuji or something will be in the background. And then I've used, from the visiting a letterpress studio and doing a residency at University of Arizona, the old way that they would print the postcards with the letterpress. And so also just kind of pulling from that way that we would share images through postcards, through the uke prints in the 1800s, postcards later on, maybe now everything's just a hashtag, but it's so fun to make them. And it was also a way that I could include 50 more images that didn't make it on the wall. This is from a wildfire. This is from a volunteer project with Grand Staircase Escalante Partners, where we're doing a lot of restoration work. Also looking at the users, the protectors, the volunteers, so working with a volunteer group and raking the dirt and picking up other people's trash. And I'm doing that kind of work to protect and take care of these places. And in this image here that we've chosen to print as a large mural print, the title is Preparing for Death, so it's also thinking about the longer cycles as well. And then it's photographed in 4x5 and it's processed in water, so it's a slow image. So maybe it kind of captures all those things, the figure, time, loss, idea of cycle, idea of human cycle, and also we're in these grand places, so we're looking at deep time.
Yeah, and I would also say it speaks to your use of material and also your, maybe even we could talk about the tradition of printmaking and the way the brush stroke and the emulsion is creating this image and graphic in the work.
It's always a collaboration, whether it's with the materials or the elements or your family or the sun or the wind's blowing really hard. And then the newest prints in the show are these photo and intaglio prints. So I had done a lot of printmaking in the past, and it was this really great way to return to it. And I'm thinking in these three images a lot about the ukiyo-e print. Right, the way that the human presence in this giant, this is at Glen Canyon National Recreation Area, this is Lake Powell, these are these giant houseboats, but they're so tiny, and the way that I can introduce color into the work by layering colors of ink. So having that very tactile process, and that's how, it's not the same process as ukiyo-e, but the way that color might be laid on. So the sky is painted on last. The blue is added last. Or looking, this is my water image, this is my earth image, looking from the top of Cedar Mesa down into the Valley of the Gods. So this is the Moki Dugway. And like really using spatial compression, which is also used a lot in Japanese prints, where everything's like a layer cake or the whole view is kind of like flattened out. And then here is the sky image in that time of day, and allowing some of the human elements like the telephone poles, the road, the background where you can see the electrical lines and a couple little contrails in there, but they're still very tiny compared to the vastness of the sky. I think that there's something that's really happened to me as a human being about really trying to honor the past that's preceded me and to really acknowledge who I've been able to become today as an artist and just a human on this planet.